Hey, welcome back to the Cheap Air Gunner channel. Cherokee Steve here. Um, now that we've done the unboxing of the 1322 and I've done some shooting over the Crony with it in its stock form, we are ready to start disassembling the gun. Let's get right to it. Going to need a Phillips screwdriver. One of the things, let me go back to, I did the video on going to Crossman's website and printing up a parts list for various guns. You can get one for the 1322. It's right here. It's going to be really helpful. I suggest if you're going to be doing something like modifying your 1322 that you do the same. It's got a cover sheet here. It's got a breakdown of the each individual part, broken down and numbered. And then the other thing it'll give you is what that number corresponds to on this list, this parts list, and it also gives you Crossman's part number for it. So I highly suggest that you do this. If you're going to be taking apart your gun, if you're going to be modifying it, if any parts are lost, you can always get them from Crossman. And just going back and referring to exactly what is what as far as the individual parts and where they go. This is going to be an invaluable diagram right here. Okay? So I suggest that. Now as far as breaking it down, let's start out with something really simple and easy. We got some Phillips screws here that are holding on the grips. I'm going to leave the screws in the grips for right now. I'm going to section them off into parts of the gun and keep them together accordingly. So here's the one side of the grip. Flip the gun over and take the other one off. What we quickly see here is the spring that engages the sear for the trigger. As I said, that trigger is a very heavy pull. As you can see, as the trigger is pulled, the side of the sear, which we can't see yet until I take off the covers, covering up the safety and the sear mechanism. We have a linkage for the trigger that goes to the sear. Crossman uses an extremely heavy spring here, and that is why it is such a heavy length of pull to the trigger. So we'll be dealing with that. Not just yet. While I got the Phillips screwdriver out, we can go ahead and take the pump handle off, which is 2 Phillips screws. The heads are on this side of the pump. pretty long screws. Now, one of the things I'm going to get to and talk about while I'm taking the pump handle off is my thoughts on the pump handle itself. Now, the older version of the 1377 and the 1322 had a rounder handle with some, it mimicked a wood handle. Had some wood grain manufactured into the plastic itself. It's the handle I have on my 1377, which, as far as the feel of it and the pump itself, the pump action, the grip that you can get on it, I prefer that older style. I do like the looks of the newer style. It's kind of, unfortunately, it's kind of done backwards as far as it's got some texture up here where you're not actually going to be grabbing it so much as this indentation portion of the handle, which is smooth. Now, it would be better to have this textured, in my opinion, this textured feel and grip within this area of the pump that you're going to be grabbing. This is kind of a slick, slippery surface. Now, one of the things that was fairly common, if you have one of the older style pump handles, it was easy to because of its roundness, to want to grab it completely while you were pumping, which increased the risk of you pinching your fingers as you close the pump handle between the piston tube and the pump handle itself. Now, this kind of gets you away from that, kind of makes you want to grab it where this indentation is, which keeps your fingers away. But yet, as I said, it's somewhat of a slippery surface, which, this grippier portion would be better suited to this part. I would rather see this be smooth and have this textured portion of the pump handle actually manufactured into this indentation portion of the pump handle. It's slippery. If you're doing the maximum amount of pumps or modifying and doing multiple pumps, this is really not a great portion of the gun that you're going to want to use. So we'll address that later, but for right now we'll just put it off to the side. I just wanted to state I'm not a huge fan of the newer style pump handle. I do like the looks of it. It's sleek. It's more streamlined than the older style, but yet as far as function, it could definitely be improved in my opinion. Now, so we're already down to this. We've got the grips off. We've got the pump handle off. Now, what we're going to be doing is with flathead screwdriver, we are going to be taking off the screw that holds in the rear sight. Now we need a flathead for that. And that's right here. It's a long screw that extends all the way down through into the piston valve tube. I'm going to keep that with the rear sight for right now. And just as a matter of information, I never did actually sight this in, knowing I was going to be removing it. That's something after reassembly we can do. Now, the next step. Underneath the bolt, there's an extremely small screw. Extremely small. And actually, if you're familiar with the 13 series guns, 1377, 1322, the recess for the head of that screw is kind of another manufactured weak link to the gun. Your pellets kind of want to drop down inside there when you're loading them. Sometimes they'll actually hang up in that particular spot. That's because they've gone down to a point with the recess for the head of that tiny breech screw, to the point where the head of the screw is well below the curved radius of the breech pellet loading portion itself, and the pellet tends to drop down in there. We'll see if there's a way we could deal with that as well. I've read some things on forums, good ideas about evening that out and keeping your pellet from dropping down inside there. Once it hangs up and you push it forward, you risk deforming your pellet, so that's something we're going to want to do. But we're going to need a very small, I believe it's a 50 thousandths Allen wrench for the head of that screw. I got to get to my toolbox and find mine. But it is built in the United States, and everything is spec'd to standard American English sizes. So you can rule out having to have metric tools. Want to keep pressure down on the breech as you remove the screw. Very small, don't want to lose it. But at that point, with the rear sight off and that small breech screw that's underneath the bolt, the breech is going to come off. The barrel can be removed from the front sight, sliding it backwards, lifting from the breech, lift the breech up, and slide backwards. There's the breech in the barrel. Now, one of the things that is exposed here now is the transfer port. This little piece right here is your transfer port. And what you're going to notice is there is a flared out portion to it, not in the middle of it, but you're going to have a part that sticks up above that flare that is longer than the part that sticks down below the flare. And that's important to remember. The longer boss, so to speak, that's above the flare is going to be facing upwards towards the barrel. There's a small seal. Want to be careful when we're removing it, this rubber seal that sits in the transfer port portion of the pump tube itself. We, for safekeeping, I'm just going to install it back onto the transfer port itself. So this is what we're left with as far as this assembly goes. The barrel simply pulls out of the breech very easily. There's the barrel port on the bottom of the barrel. As I said, I'm not going to be installing a steel breech. So as far as the bolt and breech assembly goes, we are going to hold on to that, keep that as is. I'm going to be reusing that on the assembly. Let me move these back out of the way. Now, when I pulled that bolt back to get to that small screw that was underneath, the breech screw that was underneath the bolt, what that did was pull the hammer back, which is in a cocked position. Now we want to release that. So with the safety off, we want to hold this part that's sticking up. This is attached to the hammer itself, this pin. We want to hold it and pull the trigger. And that will release the hammer. Now there's no tension. The hammer spring behind the hammer was compressed. Now when we go to remove the trigger in grip frame from the bottom of the pump tube, this back screw here, that's going to release this plug. And on the inside of this plug is the spring and the hammer itself. We don't want that in a cocked position. There is actually tension still on this plug, so we want to be careful when we remove it. We definitely don't want that hammer in a cocked position with that hammer spring extremely compressed, because that is going to make the plug, we really risk that shooting out under a lot of pressure, which we don't want. This back here is it's a square bit, but it's also slotted, so you can remove it with a flathead screwdriver. Same goes for the screw that's just forward of the trigger guard. Square bit, but it is slotted and can be removed and installed with a flathead screwdriver. The most secure way to remove it is with a square bit. If you're going to be using a flathead, make sure it is of a wider size than what was on the back end of, this particular screwdriver I have has a small Phillips and a small flathead on one end, and a larger and wider Phillips and flathead on the other. You definitely want to be using a wider type of flathead if that's the route you're going to be going. This one, because of the angle of the frame where the grip is located, you got to get to the screw itself on an angle as well. For right now, I'm just going to get it loose, and then with my thumb I'm going to hold in that hammer plug on the back of the tube. Even with the hammer in a non-cocked position, there's still going to be some tension from the hammer spring on that plug. That's why I'm keeping my thumb on it. I apologize if the view and the lighting in this whole filming is not the greatest. Screws for the pump handle. Screw I just took out, and as you'll notice, nice thing that Crossman did is it does have some blue Loctite on it. That plug is going to come out. There's the hammer spring. You'll notice that pin goes to a slot. At the end of it, towards the back where that plug was, it opens up into a much wider hole. So that hammer is going to slide back, and this pin is simply going to pull out of where that hole is. Then the hammer will come out. As you'll see, on the end of the hammer, this is the striking side. This is the striking side of the hammer. And you have an inner diameter that the spring sits in. Actually fits inside. This is one of the options that we're going to have as far as possibly filling up some of this. That will increase tension on the hammer spring, which will increase the striking force of the hammer itself. Probably going to do some polishing on this. This is extremely nice and smooth. I'm not seeing any deformity, any sharp ridges, raised burrs of any kind on the hammer. A heavier hammer is another way to increase the striking force. But I'm going to want to do as much as I can with the stock parts. So, I've got those grouped together over here. The small screw that went in the bottom of the trigger slash grip frame. The plug at the back of the pump tube, pump valve tube, the hammer spring, the hammer pin, and the hammer itself. The next thing I'm going to be dealing with is taking off the screw that's located just to the front of the trigger guard. Again, we can do that with a flathead screwdriver. I'm going to start out by just getting it loose. I'm not going to take it completely out. I'm going to want to hold this together tightly. One of the things that's going to be out in the open when these two pieces get separated, the pump valve tube gets separated from the trigger grip frame, is the spring, and extremely, if you've taken these apart before, you're very familiar with the safety mechanism. It has an extremely small spring and an extremely small ball bearing. We do not want those dropping and rolling anywhere. That's why I suggest getting something nice and soft and cushiony, a towel, something. The only reason I'm using this white pad, although it is soft, it's an absorbent pad I brought home from work, but it's to keep things from rolling. But I'm going to squeeze these together, keep it squeezed together tightly, firmly with my hand, as I back out this screw the rest of the way. One of the ways to differentiate between the screw that's just forward of the trigger guard and the screw that's in the back, the one that's forward of the trigger guard is a longer screw than the one that screws into the back. And what actually, this serves as another function, which we'll get to later. But very carefully, I'm going to lift this up. The pump valve tube is now separate, but I want to keep this upright. And right here, I don't know if you can see it, is the safety mechanism. Here's the spring. It's a tiny little thing. and what should fall out is this tiny, tiny ball bearing. You do not, I don't even know if I can hold it in a way that you'll be able to see it. But it is a tiny ball bearing. Don't want to lose that spring and ball bearing. Now the safety pin itself, there's no tension on it. It just goes back and forth. You can see the sear here. Right here. You can see the action of it as the trigger gets pulled back and the sear drops. When that hammer is in a cocked position and the sear is holding it backwards, the trigger pulls, drops the sear, which now sends the compressed hammer, with the compressed hammer spring behind it, forward, which slams into the valve pin, pressing that forward, opening up the valve, allowing the air from the valve out through the transfer port and into the barrel. Now what you see on this side is we have a plate that needs to come off. There are 3 screws holding it in, which also take a small Allen wrench to remove. Not the 50 thousandths. Next size up is 1/16 in my set anyway. Let's see if that's what we need. That is it, 1/16. I'm not going to remove it, I'm just going to break each of them loose. Not going to back them out all the way just yet. Now that I've broken all 3 loose, I will start removing them one at a time. It's got a tapered flat head to it. Two out of the 3 now I have removed. If you give me a second, I just thought of something that might help the lighting situation here, and I apologize for not having thought of it before. So give me 1 second. Okay, I took my crony lights and simply moved them up, which gives a better... I apologize. Should have thought of that before. But as far as getting back to the trigger grip frame and the cover on it, I have one of the 3 screws left to take out. The one right above the trigger. Three of 3. There's the cover plate. The safety needs to be rotated and pulled up. You'll feel when it's in the right spot and can be pulled up. Now we have the sear pin, the sear spring. This is a really thick, heavy spring. You know, when you go to try to compress it in your fingers, you understand why the weight of the trigger pull is as heavy as it is. Then we have the trigger itself, the pin, and this bent washer. That's how they try to take the slack out of the side-to-side movement of the trigger itself with this bent washer. For the time being, I'm going to keep all that. I'm going to keep this in the spot that it came out of. So, got everything mechanism-wise from the grip slash trigger area of the gun right here. The breech barrel, pump assembly, valve assembly, tube here, grips, pump arm, hammer, and all of its related parts over here. Keep the screws for this plate with the plate itself. And what I'm keeping together over here, trying to keep separated, is the transfer port and that little breech screw that goes underneath the bolt. I'm going to keep that with the transfer port. If you'll notice on the pump tube itself, the hole for that little screw is right next to where the transfer port sits. What we'll get to next is disassembling the pump tube. Now that's going to involve removing the roll pin that's up here, which will allow the front sight and the plug, it's all one piece. the barrel, holds the barrel, includes the front sight, and the plug for the front of the pump tube will all come out after we get that roll pin out. That will allow the pump arm and the pump piston itself to slide out of the front after we get this piece off.